this town proudly call it the Bride of Kurdistan. But the bride has been looking and sounding differently. Such as Saif Ali. His family escaped his hometown of Fallujah and the grip of ISIL 7.
We found Shaklawa to be a haven for Arabs.
Shaklawa is a historic Kurdish town, popular with tourists. Its population is 25,000. But in the last 3 years, 38,000 Sunni Arabs from Fallujah have arrived, more than doubling the town size and shifting its demographics.
It's problem for using the services, the roads, the electricity, the water, the health centers. What can we do? We hope they're going back safely. Otherwise, they are our guests.
Ali says the Arabs have lived harmoniously among the Kurds, and both communities have adapted bits of one another's culture. He's also keenly aware that he's viewed as a guest, tolerated for his extended stay only because of the humanitarian crisis in Iraq.
The difficulty lies in not being part of the Kurdish community. We are Arabs after all, and that causes some sort of sensitivity, that it's not much talked about, but it's still apparent. We have red lines that we cannot cross.
The Kurds we spoke to all echoed the same sentiment. They embrace the displaced Arabs, but they're looking forward to Shaklawa returning to its roots.
The Kurdish and Iraqi government in Baghdad must work out a plan to bring Arabs back to their hometowns. We have brotherly ties, but this area is overcrowded with Arabs and we can barely see any Kurds.
ISIL fighters were pushed out of Fallujah in late June. It could take months for the Iraqi army to deem the city safe enough for its former inhabitants to return. Despite the wait, Ali is optimistic that soon he won't be living as the Kurds' guest, but back home, trying to rebuild his life. Natasha Ghanem, Al Jazeera, Shaklawa, in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq.
Well, let's get back now to our top story, the conflict in Syria. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon says he is appalled by what he calls the chilling escalation of violence in Aleppo, and he's warning the use of indiscriminate weapons could be a war crime. Humanitarian organizations estimate that the Syrian regime has dropped thousands of barrel bombs on residential areas, but the government denies it. They are usually made from a large metal container like an oil drum, but the barrels become a deadly device when they are packed with shrapnel, nails, fuel and explosives. The unguided bombs are typically dropped from helicopters, killing civilians and inflicting severe damage to property. To help explain why diplomacy continues to fail in Syria, let's bring in Reem Turkmani in London. She is a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. Thanks very much for being with us. So broadly speaking, then, what is your assessment of the current situation in Syria, and what are the prospects for any peace at this point?
Well, you have Aleppo, a city that many did not hear about maybe a few years ago. Now suddenly on the top level table between the US and Russia. So until the real and firm and strong agreement comes between the US and Russia, we don't expect the situation to de-escalate in Aleppo at all. I mean, very clearly when they are agreeing together, we see a cessation of hostilities in Syria, we see reduction in the number of civilians being killed, and when there is a fallout between the US and Russia, we see the de-escalation again, we see the Syrian regime taking the liberty, exploiting the splits and bombarding civilian areas, dropping barrel bombs, and then denying it. We don't know right now. I mean, everybody I spoke to, all the diplomats, analysts, they say it's very complicated. We can't see through this. But most people are waiting eagerly for a firm and strong US-Russian agreement, because that is the only thing that is going right now to make a difference to the situation on the ground.
What do you think Russia's motivations, since you mentioned them, what do you think Russia's motivations are in this? Because the argument has been made that they are simply using the conflict in Syria as a kind of a bargaining card with the United States to get other concessions on on other issues in the world, such as Ukraine, for example. What do you say to that?
I think it's really beyond even Ukraine right now. I mean, let's remember Russia, lost in the Cold War and ended up being humiliated. And right now it's trying to pressure the U.S. to bring it to a position where it's fighting together with the U.S. against one enemy. I mean, the ceasefire that was announced on the 12th of this month was meant to be extended after 1 week, and during that week, if it's relatively successful, the trophy of that week was that the U.S. and Russia both together fight Jabhat al-Nusra or the Fath al-Sham in Syria. And this is something never happened before. I mean, these two enemies fighting together, so sharing intelligence, coordinating military operations. This is what Russia wanted. But the last 2 days of the first week were very bad. Things escalated, and things didn't look like, a ceasefire that can be celebrated and that they can move to the next step. The U.S. is still very reluctant also to fight together with Russia, have joint military operations, share intelligence. I mean, there's even within the American administration, there are different views on this, what they see a very controversial issue.
But this is a conflict that has raged for, and no side has really made any significant gains. It is a complete stalemate. Do you think that at some point there is no other option but to get back to the negotiating table? And do you think that all of the sides concerned will eventually come to realize this?
To be honest, from day one, the situation was such as there is no other choice but to go back to the negotiation table. Things never looked as there's going to be a victory for one side or the other. And I think they all knew eventually they will have to go to the negotiation table. But every time the talks, look like likely, you see also a de-escalation where actors just commit more violence, more crimes, hoping that the other side will come to the negotiation table with less expectations. But it just never worked. And particularly the Syrian regime, I mean, after the Russian support is feeling the boost, is feeling that it can achieve some serious military advancement to change the terms completely on the table. But the result of all of this is, thousands of civilians and war crimes. I mean, the Secretary General said this could be a war crime. It is a war crime. There is no other word for this.
Good to get your perspective on this. Reem Turkmani joining us there from London. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our local newspapers across the world are struggling to stay afloat in an age when more people are getting their news for free online. But one paper in a rural area of the U.S. state of Vermont has come up with a novel way to attract new, enthusiastic owners. Gabriel Elizondo reports.
Hot off the printing presses, the Hardwick Gazette newspaper arrives and is ready for delivery. And for Ross Connolly, the publisher of the Gazette, it's time to deliver his beloved newspaper to the local shops. The paper has just a few staff who do all the jobs, reporting, photography, and the bookkeeping.
It does require a lot of hours. It does require a lot of hard work, but there's also a lot of reward in it.
After owning the Gazette for 30 years, Connolly is ready to retire, so he put the paper up for sale, but there were no buyers. At risk of the paper closing up for good, Connolly came up with a last-ditch effort to save it, an essay contest. Write an essay on why you think you'd be the best owner of the newspaper, submit a $175 entry fee, and the person with the best essay is the new owner and publisher of the Hardwick Gazette. The paper was first published in 1889 and been telling the story of Hardwick every week ever since. Old typeset machines still are in the office, a relic of the paper's past. And it's not only here. In small towns all across America, community newspapers are struggling to survive as more people get their news online or from social media. So if one of
Gay men and women can now marry legally, but only in some states. Catholic Church leaders are opposing plans by President Enrique Peña Nieto to legalize marriage across Mexico. Mexico ruled last year that marriage restrictions are discriminatory. Rio de Janeiro is clearing up after the Olympic Games and the Paralympics, of course. They were a celebration of racial ethnic. But while the world watched the games, the number of poor young black men killed by security forces rose substantially. Human rights groups say racism is a problem many Brazilians need to confront. Daniel Schweimer reports from Rio.
Part of the Olympic legacy was renovation of Rio's dock area, during which sites related to the city's slave trading past were discovered. This tour tells of the brutality of that period. 2 million slaves landed here. Many died shortly afterwards and were buried in mass graves. Many Brazilians say racism, rooted in slavery, has not gone away and is not being addressed.
Se você é negro, está saindo do alemão, normalmente você vai ser abordado, você vai ser...
If you're a black man, by the police. Being a young black man in Alamau, each day of life is a celebration.
We had to cut short filming in the poor neighborhood of Alamau when we heard gunfire. We later learned that a policeman was killed and another wounded. 2 people who live in the area were also wounded, an almost daily occurrence.
I can only hope that my 17-year-old daughter has a future, that she survives, because people here are dying and are being killed. She will have to struggle to survive. I'm fighting so that she can have a future.
It's in places like... Security was tight throughout Rio de Janeiro before and during the Olympic Games. Visible, reassuring for all to see. But operations in the favelas were less open and were hardly reported. People here say they know what happened, but their voices are rarely heard. Daniel Schweiner, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
We're still ahead on Al Jazeera. Scratching and spinning their way to the top round in London. And question marks over Tour de France champion Bradley Wiggins claims that he only took steroids to help with an asthma problem. Sana will have the details in sport.